Hey guys, today we're going to have a quick video testing Gears of War Reloaded using the RX 9060 XT 16GB. We're using the XFX Swift OC version of the card. It is an MSRP model of our 9060 XT here. Playing on the latest AMD drivers, and we are pairing with the 9800 X3D as well as 64GB of DDR5. Now this is an overkill setup for our CPU. I am looking into potentially building a secondary PC for some of these more lower end cards with more, appropriate CPU pairings. However, in this particular title, it shouldn't matter. I did some brief testing prior to this recording, and this is not a CPU-intensive game whatsoever, even down at 1080p all the way up to 4K. The CPU is hardly taxed at all, so I actually don't think, as long as you have a somewhat modern CPU, it shouldn't really be much of a difference here. Let's hop in. All right, here we're starting off at 1080p. There is a 240 FPS cap, pretty high, but there is a cap built into the game. We're starting off here at max settings using native FSR. Unfortunately for our anti-aliasing, there's not really super great options. We have FSR and we have FXAA. Those are our only two options, unless we just want to disable anti-aliasing altogether. I wish that there was a TAA option. FXAA is okay, and it certainly is very lightweight. It just doesn't look quite as good as TAA, so I'd like to see a TAA option, but especially at 1080p, I wouldn't use TAA anyways. We are going to use FSR native here. Everything at max settings. The only thing I'm going to change here is just turning off motion blur. So here at max settings, again, we have a 240 cap that we kind of have to keep in mind here. So that's really the max of what we would ever get is that 240 FPS. So anything more than that is basically just going to go to waste. But you can see we're just right about butting up against that cap. It's really, really close. And definitely a really solid place to play. Now, a game like Gears of War, difference between 200, 240, things like that. It's not going to be super severe. I will also mention that I'm going to be just testing single player for this particular test. Now, for Gears of War, I have found that multiplayer is slightly less intensive. So it's about like 15%, maybe something like that, 15%. Less intensive in multiplayer. So here we're kind of hovering around 240 with our average at 216. This would be a really consistent 240 FPS in multiplayer. So that is something to keep in mind if you were just someone who was just looking for a multiplayer option. You will definitely see better performance here in multiplayer than single player. But really, the game looks great. It's rendering everything really beautifully. 6 GB of video memory. Jumping into a cutscene here, you can see cutscenes obviously are capped at 30 FPS. Go ahead and restart counting here. But as you can see, really great performance here. Really, I wouldn't personally make any sort of changes at 1080p. You could, of course, bump down some settings, get a more consistent 240 FPS. But really, chasing that extra few FPS, in my personal opinion, is not super significant. And because we don't have FSR 4 in this particular title, it's a DirectX 12 title, so if we're just sticking to single player here, you could, go in, use something like Optiscaler to kind of inject and force FSR 4, but again, this game does have anti-cheat, so making any sort of changes to game files or using something, like Optiscaler is something that I would, personally typically try to avoid, but if you were okay making that, quote-unquote risk or whatever you want to call it, of injecting a different form, you could do that. But pretty solidly, hitting that FPS cap with 240. You can see rock solid 240 here, 229 on our average, really smooth frame time. So 1080p really not going to be an issue whatsoever for us here, regardless of settings. Now, I will say here we are experiencing, like with some effects, like slight dips down to 200 FPS. So again, I don't think it's super significant, but maybe it is worth testing just down to high settings. So let's just come here, and we were on ultra. Let's just bump down to high. We'll stick with native here if we can find it. So we'll stick with native and go ahead and force motion blur off. So same settings here, just bumping down to high from ultra. All right, so bumping down to high settings here. I did reload the game, which is necessary, or at least the game tells you it's necessary when changing these settings. Does seem to give us a slight FPS boost. You can see we're kind of like in a similar space here where we're most of the time at 240 FPS, some dips below 240, but really consistent frame times and really solid experience here. You can see, like with a bunch of enemies rushing in, we do see some dips. There's a enemy on me, but some slight dips below 240 FPS. Like here you can see right around 200, but 1% low is really, really strong. Really no, complaints as far as our FPS in my opinion. And really, for a game like this, a remaster, I think a big part of the reason that you're playing a game like this is to get, the updated visuals. So playing a remaster like this and bumping down to low settings, or even medium settings on a modern GPU, in my personal opinion, it doesn't really make a ton of sense, and I don't think it's really necessary considering the fact that we're getting essentially 240 FPS all the time. Our dips, when we are getting them, are coming to like 240 down to 190, so they're not significant dips, and still feels like a really, really solid experience. All right, now moving over to 1440p, and we are back on our high settings here. Now we are using FSR at native here. Not quite as necessary here at 1440p to use like these kinds of advanced anti-aliasing solution, but it will make for a sharper picture. And we did test it at 1080p, so I do want to see what we can get here at 1440p. So here at 1440p, you certainly can see that we are getting hit with a slight, maybe more than a slight FPS hit. I mean, in my opinion, this still looks really, really solid, as seemingly it looks like I forgot to turn off motion blur again. So let's make sure that that's turned off. We'll go ahead and restart counting here, but obviously, still really, really solid FPS in my opinion. Not necessarily really coming close to that 240 cap at this point, but what I like about the way the game's behaving is that even when we're not hitting our cap, we are still getting consistent frame times, solid performance, and the game still looks great. So you can come in here, play at 200 and or 1440p rather, and still get a really, really solid experience. Not necessarily hitting the cap here, but definitely enough FPS in my opinion that you're going to be having a really, really solid experience. And this way you're getting, the experience a little more consistently. So, it's really to each their own. If you are someone who really just wants like best possible, graphics here, you can certainly do so. But we don't have FSR 4, so at 1080p I wasn't really wanting to utilize any sort of upscaling if I could help it, which we didn't really need to. But now as we move to 1440p, you can see that we are getting some dips into the 90s. Not low FPS by any means, but we are definitely entering the space where some upscaling not only might be beneficial as far as our performance, but also might help in terms of not actually resulting in too bad of a picture. So let's do just that. Let's just crank down to quality here, sticking with our ultra settings here, and you can see the game still looks great. It's still using FSR as our anti-aliasing method rather, so still looks really solid, getting a good looking picture here. And maybe it looks a little bit softer than the native option, but really still looks pretty solid. And now where we were getting, around 100, we're getting like 100 plus FPS improvement here, touching that 240 cap with really no major impact to our actual, picture quality here. It still looks really, really solid. Maybe slightly softer, but nothing too terrible. Now let's go the other way and use FXAA here at native. So this is definitely the cheapest form of anti-aliasing. Now at 1440p, anti-aliasing, as you begin to increase resolution, anti-aliasing does become to be, less and less like important, like to have a super advanced form of anti-aliasing. So really here at 1440p, in my opinion, the game looks really, really solid. We'll get into some motion here. I'm not really noticing, to be honest with you, a major impact, like as far as like the game looking terrible or anything like that. So I completely screw up my reload here, but this is definitely another way that you can kind of reclaim some of that FPS without using any sort of upscaling. So we are, playing at that native resolution and still getting, really, really solid FPS. So, it's a well-optimized game. It's an old game, of course, so it shouldn't be super surprising that we are getting such good FPS, but definitely nice to see that, we have a lot of options here. The only thing that I really wish that we had that we don't have is I wish that we did have FSR 4, so that when we did kind of resort to those upscaling methods, that didn't result in as blurry of a picture. But is what it is. It's not the end of the world, and the game still looks really great, and you're able to get good performance at native resolution. It's just if you're kind of looking to squeeze that last bit of FPS out of the card, you are going to have to make some compromises as we begin to increase our resolution here. Now, of course, the other option that we have here is, rather than going for all these sort of anti-aliasing method switches and upscaling is just to kind of bump down our settings. So let's see what going down to high, sticking with native here does for us. So here, moving down to high settings, it's another way to get some more of that performance back. So you definitely have some options. Really, you know, my opinion, solid performance. I can't really tell a major difference here between like ultra and high settings, to be completely honest. Textures all look really great. No, I mentioned that 1080p, but seemingly it's like a, you know, like very similar type performance. I mean, I wouldn't really be too upset about playing at high settings as opposed to just, you know, going over to the ultra preset. I don't think it's like a major difference. So if you do prefer or like the type of performance that you're getting here as opposed to at ultra, it is certainly another option for you. And this way you can kind of use that really sharp looking anti-aliasing method, you know, playing at native resolution and still get, you know, a high level of FPS. So definitely both really solid options. I'm not sure exactly where I would be. I mean, I personally think that, you know, the FPS that we were getting at ultra already was serviceable and definitely okay for what I'm expecting for a game like this. But if you wanted a bit more, this is, you know, certainly another option that you may want to consider. All right, and lastly here, moving up to 4K. So this will be, you know, it's definitely beyond what the card is really designed to do. We're going to start off at ultra settings just to see, because we did do ultra settings on our other options, but I'm going to take it easy. So we're going to go ultra using FXAA for anti-aliasing, native resolution, otherwise everything max out, and then we'll go ahead and turn motion blur off. All right, so here at 4K max settings, again, we're using FXAA for anti-aliasing. You don't really need super advanced anti-aliasing when it comes to using 4K resolution. So you don't need FSR native. In fact, that would just put an undue stress on the GPU. And here you can kind of see what I meant earlier in the video, just about how the 9800X 3D is not really super relevant. It's not a good pairing in general, just because, you know, most people who have a, you know, 9060 XT probably don't have a 9800X 3D. However, in this particular test, it doesn't really matter. As you can see, we're only reaching like 6%, 7% utilization for our CPU. So obviously, you know, playable FPS here, getting, you know, around 60s, looks like 70 on our average. We'll get higher FPS in indoor situations, but in general, really solid performance here. Just not, you know, a high refresh rate experience at 4K. So obviously we're at ultra settings here, so we will immediately, before we even introduce any sort of upscaling, immediately bump down to high and then see if we can even get something like remotely playable or remotely, you know, competitive as we kind of move forward. Or, you know, actually, since we're here, it's not too much work. Let's go ahead and we'll just jump in and let's play with those anti-aliasing settings. So switching over from FXAA over into our FSR mode, and let's just go through these settings real quickly here. Don't need to spend a ton of time on them. So going for quality upscaling here gets us around 100 FPS. Definitely looks really solid here, even though we're not on FSR 4. You know, when you're playing at 4K resolution, don't really need super advanced models when it comes to our FSR or anti-aliasing, really anything, because we're working with so many pixels anyways. Really just looks good regardless. So here, you know, utilizing as a, saw that little cog icon. Does that mean that there's a dog tag nearby? But really, you know, you don't need super advanced anti-aliasing or upscaling options when you're working from 4K. You can pretty much, you know, kind of take it easy in the card in a lot of ways and get pretty solid performance. So around 100 here with quality. Next up here is just moving down to balanced. And balance gives us another pretty significant boost. Still looks pretty solid here in my opinion. Not really any major issue that I'm noticing. Of course, you know, we'll move forward a little bit without changing settings, because I do want to see how this operates in an outdoor scene. I found too is like these more enclosed environments like we're in now, these typically get a little higher FPS because, you know, understandably there's not really a ton going on. So in general, you know, pretty solid performance here. Moving forward, still sticking right around that 130 range or so. Game looks great. I wouldn't have any issue, you know, playing on these particular settings. Let's try like a more intensive effect here. So like using our Hammer of Dawn weapon here, it does drop our FPS slightly, like into the 115 range briefly, but even in an outdoor environment like this, still looks really strong. So no major issues here. So this is definitely another way you can kind of just say, hey, I want to play at 4K max settings, utilize the upscaling, and you'll be getting a pretty solid picture here. Really no major complaints coming from me. And moving even further into performance. So going into performance now, we're starting to see it just kind of creep up ever so slightly as we kind of introduce, more and more upscaling. So, it's part of the good thing about these modern GPUs. Even when you're not using FSR 4, we do have a lot of really great options. And really, you don't need FSR 4. It's nice and does result in a better looking picture, but even the older models of FSR, they work pretty well when it comes to, upscaling from, and reaching a 4K image when you're kind of asking that. It doesn't work so great when we're talking about 1080p, but if you're just looking for kind of 4K, you can definitely get here in this way. But of course, the other way, which we'll test out now, is going for, lowering our graphics presets. So where we were ultra, let's just bump down to high here. And we'll leave it over here, FXAA, to kind of test like for like. So this is native high settings using FXAA, and again, just turning off motion blur. So here, moving down to high settings does actually give us quite a bit of breathing room, even at native resolution. So it's definitely another way that you can kind of, play where you want to play at. And really, you'd have to take a look at yourself. While I do, still think that part of the reason of playing remasters, playing at max settings and having really great looking visuals, in my personal opinion, there's not really a major difference here when it comes to like if we're just going to be comparing ultra to high settings. So on a card like this, where you're not necessarily going to be just maxing out the game regardless of settings, if you'd rather have this really clean looking picture here, and FXAA, actually I'm a bit surprised or impressed at just the level of performance that we're seeing when it comes to FXAA. Typically, maybe I'm mistaken, but I've known FXAA to be a really not so great form of anti-aliasing. Now we are playing at 4K, so that definitely is helping our case here, but I was expecting the image to definitely look quite a bit worse than it does here, and at native, where we are getting definitely not like close to that 240 FPS cap. In the indoor areas, you can see that we're very high, and even outdoor areas like this, with a lot of effects going on, while we're not quite as high, we are still in a really solid space, in my opinion. So you definitely have quite a few options to play with here. You can see it drop down into the 80 there briefly as 1% lows at 60. Still feels like a very smooth experience. I mean, it's a very mature game engine, and definitely an older game, so not super surprising. But you can see just our performance here sitting right around 118 in this particular scene. We'll go ahead and throw on our anti-aliasing at this point. So moving over from FXAA to FSR, just going for that quality anti-aliasing, or upscaling rather. So there you can see that we go, like a 30 FPS jump just going for quality. So definitely a lot of options for you to play with here. I guess the other thing I may as well check out real quick before we end is just seeing if we were to just go for, we wanted maximum possible FPS here, just going for ultra performance, just how this looks. Again, this is 14 or 4K rather, so you do have high resolution that you're working up to. I will say the image doesn't look great. That's certainly just the fault of the fact that we have an older model of FSR, but you can now pretty much, pretty consistently get really close to that 240 FPS cap. So you have a few different ways to kind of get there at your disposal. And although it looks like our texture resolution, like when we're not zoomed in, like because we're upscaling from such a low resolution, there's some weirdness here. But if you're okay with, you just have a 4K monitor and you don't really care about the visuals, you just want to populate, your 240 hertz 4K monitor, and this is the GPU that you have, definitely can do that with FSR, and it doesn't look too bad. There's not really any sort of like really terrible visual artifacts or anything like that to worry about. It's really just a little bit blurry, maybe. If that bothers you, then certainly will still be the case here. Anyways, guys, that's been the 9060 XT 16GB in Gears of War Reloaded. Not super surprising, but the card, performed just fine. This is an older game, and although it is, well, I guess it's a new game, but it's a remake of a much older game, so shouldn't be super surprising that it performed well. It's not a super demanding game, and it is nice to see that we have a lot of options at our disposal. You can play here. 1080p, 1440p is really where this card shines. When you move up to 4K is when you're going to have to either make some compromises as far as just what you're expecting when it comes to your FPS, or you're gonna have to start implementing a bit of that upscaling. But either way, you do have really solid options available to you, just so long as you are okay with actually going in and using them. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. This will probably one of my last Gears of War videos here. I think it's been well established the kind of performance that we can kind of expect in this particular title. It's a well-performing title, and really, you know, the last thing to do is just kind of test, maybe if I had time to test 1080 Ti or, you know, B580, some of like the very, very weak CPUs or GPUs rather. But really, before I kind of go too much into those particular cards, I do want to get around to building out that lower end setup with you know, maybe DDR4 and a more budget CPU pairing. So may hold off on those for the time being, but hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.